The week started with a bang. The Supreme Court's vague ruling on whether the president has the power to suspend elected officials invited a number of differing interpretations, with the main opposition PDP calling it a breach of the rule of law and democracy. Elsewhere, the CEO of the Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, Farouk Ahmed, faced weighty allegations of corruption from Aliko Dangote, culminating in Ahmed's resignation. U.S.-Nigeria tensions were tested further with an announcement from Washington that it will partially ban entry rules and visa applications from citizens from several countries, including Nigeria. With me in the studio for their expert analysis on the main stories of the week are Arise News analyst and former chairman of the editorial board of Daily Trust newspaper, Mahmoud Jega, current affairs analyst and professor of communications at the Bayes University here in Abuja, Professor Adeniyi, and public affairs analyst, Dickson Iroegbu, who is both a member of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, and an obedient. Gentlemen, glad to have you join me in the studio for analysis of events that transpired within the week. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, let's start with the Dangote, Farouk Ahmed, back and forth. Dangote, let me start with you, Prof. Why do you think Ahmed resigned? Can you tie it just to the spat between him and Dangote?
Well, that was an interesting exchange happening between an institutional capitalist, a very successful one at that, someone who has made his mark, made his name, registered some monumental feats, in the annals of Nigeria's history, and contributing tremendously to the growth of Nigeria's economy from the private sector perspective. When you have that kind of person railing against an individual, it is very unlikely that that individual will survive. And that's one. Then the second aspect of it is that it was a very rare move by Dangote, for instance. I can't remember any time I watched him or saw him engaging in a bus stop or in an outpour of emotion.
Altercation.
Yeah, get into any kind of altercation with any individual, like this. So what it means is that, something must be fundamentally amiss. And I do remember at the time when the refinery was trying to come on stream, I remember this individual, a respectable person, no doubt as well, but coming out, rather undiplomatically, saying that the fuel that Dangote was going to supply was of low quality. Well, I don't know, it might be right, but I thought something was missing in that remark. There was the absence of diplomacy, and I just feared that there might be some repercussion at some point. There might be some other things, But here we're having somebody who is very influential, and not just for the sake of it, on account of his, visible contribution to the growth of this economy, being angry with an individual. And of course, we do not expect the institutions of the state to rest on their oars, watching the exchange continuously. At some point, they were going to intervene, and I'm very confident that they did intervene and probably reined in on the individual to just throw in the towel, and to resign. And unfortunately, there was a collateral damage in the other person who had to also resign. So, but I think with the resignation now, I think there should be some kind of out-of-court settlement, going by the nature, going by how disputes are resolved in this country. We expect that there should be some out-of-court negotiation, resolution of the crisis, so that it will not snowball, because no one will want what actually happened to the individual with respect to the kind of allegations that Dangote was bringing up, because it concerns the children, you would ordinarily want that aspects not to be brought into the public space, but because accountability is also involved, it may not, however, matter. But somehow, I want to believe that we'll probably have seen the most heated part of the argument. I want to believe that some behind-the-scene negotiation will be on so that it could be probably resolved, as the case could be.
Well, there are some monopolistic tendencies, and that was not what you raised. Was not the only thing that Ahmed said. Ahmed was strong on the fact that NMDPRA will not just tolerate things being done wrongly, and that probably irked Dangote too. I mean, that must be brought into focus. But let me come to you, Mahmoud. Do you think there were undertones to his resignation? There has been talk that about, Tinubu boys being on the waiting queue, on the wings to occupy this particular position that Farouk Ahmed occupied.
Well, I understand that both Mr. Komolafe and Farouk Ahmed, their tenure is supposed to end early next year, because they were appointed, I think, for 5-year terms in 2021 by the Buhari administration. So it's like they were already coming to the end, although possibly they were hoping for a second term in office. So it couldn't have been coincidental that the sudden resignation of both of them came hot on the heels of this rather unusual press conference by the country's biggest businessman. You see, I was wondering when I heard it. As Prof said, it was very, very unusual of a man like Dangote to really go to the gutter against one individual, even though maybe given what happened about the allegations in the last year or two, I could imagine he is very angry, because to invest $20 billion into a project that could help this country tremendously, economically and in terms of energy security. And if he believes that things are being done to cripple or to allay it, then I can understand his anger. But he still, I think, went off the rails, because even though the part of his statement that got the biggest public interest is the allegation that Farouk Ahmed spent $5 million to educate his children in Switzerland, which is below the belt, as Prof said. The important thing is the regulatory issue. It is very important for Nigeria to bend over backwards and protect and promote the Dangote refinery. $20 billion is the single biggest investment we got in this country in a long time and in a critical area. But on the other hand, there must be some important regulatory concerns. There must be. And you cannot ask the regulatory authorities to shelve all the regulatory issues, maybe in order to help. And also, as you suggested, there were accusations by other businessmen that the Dangote business empire has been monopolistic in some other areas, like in sugar and in cement and other things. And the allegation is that they are moving in that direction in the petroleum sector. I don't know whether that is true, but if there are indications to that effect, then it is very important to have firm regulatory issues and to enforce them. However, the government should have told us, you see, beyond the resignation of the two chiefs, they should clear the air on really what are the regulatory issues, what is it that Dangote is protesting against, because he said, I think, that licenses have been issued to many marketers to import fuel, even though his refinery could supply, I think, all the nation's fuel supply, maybe not immediately, but in the near future. So I think, like, the National Assembly should better conduct a full investigative hearing in public and let us hear what exactly is he saying and what is the response if the authority is issuing licenses to other people to import. Why? Is it because they are not satisfied with the production capacity of the refinery, or or even the NMPC is also important. So what exactly is the situation? And we should not be entirely diverted by the allegation that the man spent, if he did that, so many millions on the education of his children. ICPC and could investigate that if any public funds were used. But for the rest of the country, the important thing is to come back to the main issue that caused this friction between such a major national investor and a very critical regulatory authority.
Wonderful. To you, Dickson, is it a little bit confusing why Gbenga Komolafe of the NUPRC also resigned? Is it a little confusing for you that he was caught in the web, whatever web, if there was a web here?
Thank you. The system is the system works together. If Farouk Ahmed, as accused by Comrade Aliko Dangote, GCON, and I call him Comrade deliberately because what we saw him do was very unusual. It's very unusual what he did, the whistleblowing and all of that. Just like when some of us keep saying that the issue of removal of subsidy shouldn't have been what government of our country should be involved in, but rather fight the corruption, the rot in the system. And for a man, Aliko Dangote, who has invested hugely in that sector, and making this kind of revelation that we now got, and the two chiefs have been said to resign. But it shouldn't end there. At this time, I expected that the investigation should commence in earnest, because if a public officer lives beyond his earnings, then indeed it calls for serious questioning, and I don't think we should take this lightly. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of rot in the oil sector, and that is what has played out. Resignation of these individuals is not enough, as far as I'm concerned. And I think the APC government, especially the Ahmed Bola Tinubu government, seem to be treating allegations as we have in this case, with levity. Once the said individual resigns, and that's it, and we just move on. So for me, this is a major area that every citizen of our country should, be interested in, because the removal of that subsidy is what has, gotten this nation into what we find ourselves in today. So if these rots are now being reviewed by the highest investor in that sector, then indeed, this is actually what should have been tackled and not the...
Yeah,
the two of them resigned. For me, it's not enough. Sincerely, it's not enough.
Yeah, we must also point out the fact
they should also face the music.
All right, we must also point out the fact that Aliko Dangote, what he did was an allegation, and like Mahmoud has said, and like you pointed out, whether this should be left just lying there, or shouldn't the ICPC, the EFCC get in and investigate whether what is being touted is true or not? And the question of what actually caused this rift between the two? Is it that the regulatory authorities insisted that things must be done normally, and so somebody, Dangote, was irked, or that the Farouk spent money he wasn't earning to educate his children? All right, let's take this further. The Senate is up in arms. Actually, we talk about the budget appropriations bill and FG plans, planning fresh loans. The president today presented the 2026 budget. He calls it budget of consolidation, resilience, and shared prosperity. That's what he calls it. But the Senate is up in arms against the executive over the practice of implementing multiple budgets in a single year. It says it's unacceptable. I mean, just for your information, in 2024, you had 3 budgets operating simultaneously, that is at the same time. In 2025, the same thing. You have the 2025, 2026. I had the spokesman of the Senate, Adeniyi, here yesterday, who says, well, they're trying to stop it, but that the 2026 budget, 2025 budget will also run into 2026, but by March, it will be ironed out. Prof, what do you make of what the Senate is saying and the fact that we operate multiple budgets in a single year? It's an anomaly. It's odd.
Definitely odd. Definitely inappropriate, because it can be very confusing, and of course there won't be clarity. And the question of transparency and accountability that we're trying to inject in the system will hardly be realized if that is not discontinued. And this has been in our consciousness over the years. Oftentimes we have tried to correct it, to rectify it, but every other time again we'll come back to it, we'll come back to that kind of inordinate practice. I remember only very recently when distinguished Senator Lawan was president of the Senate, he was very concerned about us having the budget cycle conforming with the January to December calendar year. And of course, there's nothing wrong, even if it's going to come in the middle of the year, because that's what is operational in some other countries, in America, in the United Kingdom, even in South Africa. It doesn't really conform with the Gregorian calendar year, but it's our pattern that it should be January to December. And they try to conform with it, but of course 2 years ago we started deviating again, such that we're now modeling these budgets into the next year. At some point again where it was gratifying that just the capital component will stroll into the next year, ending in March, June, but again it became somewhat confounding further in the last few years, and it's increasingly becoming worrisome. So I'm not surprised if the Senate is concerned about it, and I'm very confident that some of these things actually come from management determination. How well are we determined to correct it? Why are we not being consistent? Why are we not? It's just simply, to put it simply, it's simply attitudinal. And of course, the oversight level is also very important, not just from the legislature, which is constitutionally assigned with that task, but also from the implementing executive itself. So if there can be some attitudinal change towards this, I think we can make some progress in this regard. Then, of course, it's also worrisome that we're going into a huge debt again to finance portions of it. Maybe we could reiterate this once again, like we were doing in the period of President Buhari, that it is not about going into too many debts, to finance our expenditures, our expenses. There are some other things that we can inject into the process so that we can minimize the way we spend money. Corruption is still very rife. So much waste is still in the system. What are we doing about all these things? How well are we managing the resources that we have in our hands? Before we start looking at borrowing. Then remember again that we started making a lot more money with the removal of subsidy. What are we doing with those funds that we made? Are we being accountable in the way we are using them? It was gratifying from the president's speech that there have been some savings, no doubt, with the public procurement process, and of course there have been some debarment of contractors. And again, Nigeria First project is also gratifying. But beyond the ones that are happening, what about the many other elements that are still very concerning? Remembering that it is the concerning ones that will usually undo the budget implementation process. I think we need to be mindful of this so that at the end of the day we can say that we can increase the performance or implementation quotient, or as the case could be, of the budget overall.
All right, I hope we'll be able to talk about that performance because of the budget, which is causing this dovetailing of a budget for this year to enter into the next year and then the next year. But Mahmoud, what do you even make of the flip-flop between the president and his coordinating minister of economy Iroegbu on revenue target. While the president says the AG has met its target for 2025 ahead of Edu says they have only achieved 10.7 trillion naira out of projected 40.8 trillion. That's not up to 1/3. What message does this send to investors and to Nigerians?
It was, as many people said, very embarrassing, and I thought the president will address that issue squarely in his budget presentation today, because it was quite embarrassing that he said the country met its revenue target up to August, or was it September, only for the coordinating minister of the economy to say that there was a nearly 30 trillion naira shortfall. So it's like something is fundamentally wrong with the projections and the planning. All the basis of the planning, like the number of barrels of crude oil that you produce every day, and also the projection of the international price of a barrel of crude oil, and all the other things upon which you base your calculation, you should better examine them in a fundamental manner. The president said at the budget presentation today that this rolling over and implementation of several budgets in 1 year will end in March next year. So, we hope so, although honestly it is important to interrogate the administration and hear what is the concrete plan. For example, you know, when Prof said very correctly that the January to December financial year is not a God-given anything. You can change it due to your convenience. After all, even within Nigeria here, many corporations do not operate January to December. Some they do June, July to December, or things like that. So if necessary, if it is the solution to this problem, why not say, okay, this 2024 and 2025 budgets will run through March next year. And then if we insist on the January to December deadline, then perhaps what we can do is promulgate a budget that will cover March to December next year. You can do a 9 months budget. You don't have to do a 1 year's budget. You can do a 9 years budget and say by the end of 2026, that one has finished, and then we can now start on a clean slate from January 2027. Otherwise, you can imagine the mess now. The budget is being presented almost at Christmas time. It's extremely late. I can't remember when we did this in the last so many decades, and it is still not very, very clear what will happen to the revenue shortfall. Already, there are complaints that the government has been borrowing in the last few months. Every few weeks you will hear that the National Assembly has been requested to approve a loan. And also the National Assembly does not do a thorough job of it to the satisfaction of Nigerians. You hear that this request has come, and by evening it has been approved. You hardly hear proper interrogation. What will we do with this money, and how will we repay, and how do we avoid sinking back into the debt trap? I can imagine what a man like former President Obasanjo will say, that I took 18 billion naira of was it Gulf War windfall or something, and cleared the debt so that we don't go back into this, and now slowly we are sinking back into the same situation. We must really be very, very careful.
All right, Dickson, quickly, let me come to you before we start thinking about going and coming back. Do disclose that the government had borrowed about 14.1 trillion naira during the year in an effort to bridge the funding gap created by the revenue shortfall he talked about. But Tinubu says the government is no longer borrowing. I am trying to wrap my head again around this. What's your sense, Dickson?
This is what you get when you have the legislative arm and the executive arm in the same bed. With all the disgrace that we are seeing, even at the presentation of the budget today, we still heard that on their mandate they shall stand. It's quite shameful. What the legislative arm ought to be telling the president by now is he should resign. The president clearly has failed in performance in every indices you can consider it from. What if I were to be in the National Assembly? I will be, because honestly, we cannot continue doing this this charade that we are experiencing under the Tinubu government. After the removal of subsidy and all the promises that came with it, that when it's removed, the issue of borrowing and all of that would have become a thing of the past. But unfortunately, we're still borrowing, and the government is living large, while the Nigerian people are going through excruciating economic. So it's unfortunate. What we're seeing is simply the lack of oversight, because the legislative arm has sold its soul to the executive arm. So they cannot engage, they cannot question the activities, the failures of the government. Rather than call for the president's resignation, they are singing for, on their mandate they shall stand. It's shameful. No wonder Donald Trump described the nation as a now disgraced nation, because everything seems to be working negatively, contrary to the expectations of the Nigerian people. So for us in the opposition, it's shameful, to say the least. It's,
all right.
It's very, very shameful,
all right.
What we are seeing.
All right, when we get back, gentlemen, we'll still talk maybe a little bit about the budget concerning the skepticism around presenting, this traditional presentation of the budget. And we'll look at, he just mentioned Trump, we'll look at that from outside, and we'll look at the strike that was not. We'll also be looking at the Supreme Court judgment. I read your article on that particular judgment, Mahmoud. But we'll just get back in a bit and we'll continue. Don't go away. All right, glad to have you back. You're still watching Prime Time here on Horizon. We still have the three analysts, gentlemen, Mahmoud, Jega, Professor Adeniyi, and of course, Dickson, Iroegbu. Before we went on break, we're talking about the budget, basically. But let's just touch on it a little bit and we'll move on to some other issues. We start discussing some other issues. Some say Nigerians view budget presentations with skepticisms due to poor budget implementation, lack of transparency, and unfulfilled promises. Now, the Budget Office has not published the budget implementation report for 2025. It is said that this is the first time in 15 years. Briefly, Prof, what do you make of that before we move into another discussion?
Yeah, the problem of transparency, the lack of accountability, is still a very big problem with our public financing system, and it's an elephant in the room, something that we need to be concerned about. At the time we had the Freedom of Information Bill passed in 2011 or so, we were quite somewhat happy that there will be some transparency in the public expenditure process on account of civil society organizations, writing agencies, trying to get details of their expenditure process. But of course, that bill has been implemented, obeyed in the breach. So again, the opacity is still continuing, and we are seeing it degenerating, which is actually very unfortunate. It's something that is very concerning, and if government is talking about it, directly or indirectly, I think it's probably just a welcome development. But it should go beyond just pronouncements. We also need some level of execution, some level of action, towards remedying the situation.
All right. I'll come to you, Mahmoud, Jega. Let's move from discussing the budget to the Supreme Court judgment on the Rivers State. Farouk agrees with the lone dissenting voice. That's the justice who was 6-1, who said that the president does not have the power to suspend elected people. And the judgment came after 9 months. They said justice denied justice delayed is justice denied. So the question of the judgment of the Supreme Court, I mean, so many interpretations, but I interviewed Falana here who said that the president doesn't have the power to suspend elected people. It's nowhere in the Constitution, Mahmoud.
Unlike Falana, who is a big lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, but somehow I also agree with the dissenting judge. And that is because in the course of my career as a political reporter, I reported on the 2007-2008 Supreme Court ruling in the matter instituted by Atiku Abubakar when, as vice president, his seat was declared vacant because he defected from PDP to AC that time. And the Supreme Court ruled after the administration had left office that no, you cannot declare his seat vacant because he defected, because the Constitution mentioned 4 ways in which an executive officer can lose his position, and that is resignation, impeachment, incapacitation, and death, and it didn't mention defection. And the Supreme Court said in 2008 unanimously that you cannot add anything to the Constitution that it did not state. Now, I heard after this judgment, some people were saying, no, but the Supreme Court is not about talking about removal, it is talking about suspension. Where was it said in the Constitution that an elected governor or legislature can be suspended under a state of emergency? Okay, instead they said that the Constitution provides that the president can declare a state of emergency and he can take extraordinary measures. Fine, but it didn't say that those extraordinary measures include suspension of a governor. And it is the same Supreme Court that said you cannot add to the Constitution what it did not clearly state, especially since it had stated 4 other conditions in which such an officer can be removed. Extraordinary measures, honestly, in most climes, in a state of emergency means suspension of constitutional liberties, like all this freedom of speech, of assembly, and all that. All those the president can suspend, and then, of course, he can flood the situation with security agencies in order to restore order. Because even practically speaking, you say, okay, if there is a breakdown of order in a state, maybe caused by insurgents or other people, of what practical import is the removal of the state governor? Unless you are saying he is the one who caused the commotion. Of what use? Because you remove the elected governor and put a sole administrator. Okay, of what practical purpose is it? What it envisages is for the federal authorities to come to the aid of the state authorities. That is my own understanding of this situation. So, unfortunately, I agree with the dissenting judgment.
Yeah, like you said,
Supreme
yeah.
Court
All right, this thing, I come to you now. He's raised some issues. And I remember, one, the question of why wait for 9 months? You are the PDP bloc. And as we discuss, Fubara is now in APC. The 11 governors that went to court, most of them have moved over. Most of them have moved over to the APC. So one could start saying, well, this has been overtaken by events. But then Falana was saying, these things have to be corrected because of tomorrow. If people can't get justice in court, then there is a likelihood of resorting to self-help. Dickson.
Very true, Ndi. You rightly stated it when you mentioned justice delayed is justice denied. Finally, we now know that these so-called judges seem to be playing politics alongside the politicians. Because if not, what played out in Rivers State that led to the suspension and the suspension of the governor and the legislative, the members of the state assembly and all of that, is a complete aberration. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court that had an opportunity to redeem the possibility of a reoccurrence has rather affirmed it. So I want to predict that in the future, Lagos, where the president is said to come from, will one day experience a declaration of state of emergency and all of that, because this is a precedence. What the president has done is use his office to intimidate, to harass, and indeed co-opt those who are said to be in the opposition to his camp. That's why when we were saying those who are said to be defecting and all of that, we asked them the question, what is it that they can point to that the president has done so well that is attracting them to move to the APC? Nothing but intimidation, coercion. That's what's going on. So what we have seen that the Supreme Court has done is uphold an illegality that will one day haunt this nation.
Right.
And I hope we'll be ready to face it.
You've
because
raised...
by the time the people, like you rightly said, now say, oh, we can't find justice in the court of law, they can resort to self-help. But alas, Nigeria has been thrown to... Why, like I said earlier, that the President of America describes the nation as a now disgraced nation. It's unfortunate.
All right, well...
Very unfortunate.
My country, Nigeria, is not a disgraced nation, by the way.
No,
I'm a Nigerian.
Now, and I think
okay.
we should hear it properly. It says, now nation. Are these things happening in our country not enough to say Nigeria indeed has been disgraced?
Okay. All right. Let's come back to the studio. Thank you so much. I'll get back to you. By the way, it was not myself that said that about self-help. It was actually Falado, the Sikh, legal Sikh, who said that it might occur. That's why we need good judgment from the courts, which is very important. Prof, he's touched on a point, which of course I discussed this last week. The opposition PDP cried, they're raising their voices and are crying against what they see as a threat to multi-party democracy because of the plethora of defections. I don't know how you see that, Prof. Because I spoke to Bashir, National Secretary of the APC, and he said, what are you talking about? You still have PDP, you still have Labour Party, you still have the other parties that are still there, and you can't stop somebody who wants to get over to my party. It's freedom of association. Well, I don't know how you see it.
It's been a recurring decimal, a question that keeps coming up. But again, when politicians talk, I also understand where they are coming from. A PDP partisan, for instance, will say that it is happening because of coercion. An APC faithful will say, no, I have my house, and people want to come and say hello to me or want to be part of me. I shouldn't reject them. So you can just see the back and forth on both sides. But again, I think the fault actually, in my opinion, belongs more to the opposition, more than the receiving party. Because if the position if they were more cohesive, more united, and if they had not allowed their wall to be cracked, by some of their members as well, of course, they will argue that it was the handiwork of the ruling party. Well, again, if you are strong enough, I'm not sure infiltration will have been that possible. And we know where all these things started from. It started from the presidential election, with the contest between former governor of Rivers State, now Minister of FCT, and of course the altercation of the misunderstanding that happened with the eventual flag bearer of the party, and of course one party became very, very difficult to assuage. And of course he remained in the party and he was enjoying himself at the expense of the party and undoing them. And of course in undoing them, this is a very powerful person, rightly or wrongly, using all kinds of machinery at his disposal, covert and overt, and he's still enjoying it, he's still doing it. And it's leading to deep-seated factionalization, some level of terrible crisis of confidence that the party has found very difficult to recover from. And we are still seeing it snowballing. And that's what is leading to governors saying that they are leaving the party in practical terms. And some of the reasons these governors are giving, you can't really blame them, because the argument is that, if in the next election somebody goes to court and say, which party do you belong to? It can actually become a problem for them, and they are trying to safeguard their second term. Someone else may look at them and say, okay, why can't any of them behave like the president did when he was governor of Lagos State, when he was steadfast to remain in AD despite the onslaught of the then president against him? Well, the times have changed. It might be difficult to compare those times and the personalities involved, you know. But I think, again, in politics, we know how it works. People just through, it's a game of the art of the possible. People look at what is possible before them. They look at all the pieces, where the piece will best fit into how the piece will best fit into the jigsaw. I beg your pardon. And that's what they're trying to do, you know. Just trying to be strategic within the realm of their own understanding. But again, going forward, I've made this point before on a final note, that I'm not really bothered if one party thinks that they can continue to welcome people into their midst, because it may actually be their own undoing, you know, because when you have too many people into your group, you do not know them, and of course these people, you do not know their ideology, their principles. It might create some deep-seated, again, contradictions, and conflicts may begin to arise, and it might lead to some implosion, especially if there's a problem with management. And do not forget, this is an incumbent party. They are ruling. A lot of people joining them will be looking for spoils, and if the spoils are not expansive enough to go around, of course it will lead to crisis, you know, which is a challenge for them to manage the many people coming into their fold. So it's not just a bed of roses, like the opposition members are also thinking. But it's not late in the day. The oppositions can be very powerful. They can still come together and make a difference in 2027, so that we can have a more robust contestation.
All right, I have just about 3 minutes to tinker with these ones, Mahmoud. The question of weaponization as proffered or put forward by the opposition of security agencies, weaponization against the opposition, and then maybe you speak a little on Trump, including Nigeria, in the bans, the list of nations that have been banned from coming into the U.S. This question of FMJ, the visa, it's practically confusing for parents, for students, and for the nations. You want to talk about it, Mahmoud, before I get the last word from Dickson?
No, since there is little time, all we will say is that the government should please be careful about public perceptions, because the perception is growing that about weaponization of the anti-security, of the anti-corruption agencies, that anybody who is being accused of siphoning, in some cases, over ₦1 trillion, once he announces defection to the ruling party, that was the last we had about the issue. On the other hand, some former APC chieftains who left for other parties, then we suddenly saw old cases being reopened and they are being dragged to court and even denied bail and all that. It's not a very good image, because it may ultimately rob the anti-corruption agencies of credibility if they are seen to be working towards the political aims of the ruling party. We ought to be careful about that. That's what I will say.
All right, Dickson, incidentally, this talk is coming to you just briefly. Nigeria being included in the banned list. I mean, this is coming after the CPC imbroglio that America has with Nigeria, included on the partial, there are two lists, partial bans list, and the question of who gets visa, well, diplomats are removed, athletes are removed, and all that. What do you make of that? Just briefly, and then we call it a day.
For me, I think we should stay back in our country and fix it. We should all wake up that nobody will come from out there or up there to come and solve our problem. Until the Nigerian people realize that this country belongs to us and that we cannot allow a few or any individual at that to disgrace all of us. The perception issue and all of that, as my brother Mahmoud mentioned, the truth of the matter is that a lot has gone wrong about our country. APC has brought disgrace upon our country. And so whatever reactions we are getting from nations out there, we should not, rather it should wake us up. We should wake up to the reality of this is fatherland, and we have to get involved, engage those who are said to be leaders, ask the questions, engage them, and ensure that they account to what they promised the people when they said they were coming to lead the country.
That's a good place to leave it.
I think
That's a good
I think
place.
we should stay back and fix our country.
That's a very fantastic place to leave it, really, because if you fix your country, nobody will stay outside the country and start calling you disgraced because you want to get into their country. I'm sure, gentlemen, you agree. Exactly. All right, thank you so much, Mahmood Jega, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, and Mazi Dickson Iroegbu for contributing to this program. Well, that's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Do join us again tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. Next week, from the entire team here in Abuja. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.